South African women carry a greater tax burden compared to their male counterparts. That's according to Dr Lee-Ann Steenkamp, who's a senior lecturer in taxation at Stellenbosch Business School. Now, Dr Steenkamp is one of the authors of the 2022 Women's Report that says that the financial scales are tipped against women, especially single mothers, by the country's tax system. She also says that the country needs affirmative action in tax laws to end the disproportionate impact of VAT and personal income tax on women. And she joins us now for a further discussion on this. Dr. Lee-Ann Steenkamp, thanks so much for speaking to us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So some people may be sitting at home watching this and saying, what is she talking about? So how is the system stacked against women when it comes to taxation in South Africa?
I can understand that response because we do have a unisex tax table after all. But when we look at the annual tax statistics that are released by the South African Revenue Service, SARS, and we combine that with the information from Stats SA, we see that women still congregate in the lower income tax brackets. And there are a number of underlying factors for that. For example, women take career breaks to rear children. The caregiving responsibility still rests on women's shoulders, caring for elderly parents, taking care of sick family members, and all of that combined mean that women tend to have shorter careers, they earn less, and they fall in the lower income tax brackets. So it's not as if the tax law itself is overtly discriminating against women. I think it's more a case that it has not kept pace with the underlying socioeconomic conditions that women, especially single mothers, face.
So, Dr. Steenkamp, your report reveals that South Africa's previous discriminatory tax system of the apartheid years, which especially disadvantaged working married women, was then repealed post-94, and that the tax laws now treat women and men the same, irrespective of marital status. However, equal treatment has not had equal outcomes, you say. So please tell us about that in a little more detail.
Right. So having been a tax lecturer for more than a decade, I was surprised to find some of these issues, especially what you mentioned, the fact that there was a separate tax table for married men and a separate tax table for married women. And married women paid higher taxes under the apartheid regime. Fortunately, that has been done away with. But as you mentioned, that has resulted in unintended consequences, what I alluded to earlier. So my suggestion is that government specifically take a look at the gender impact of our tax laws, especially for lower income women and especially for single mothers. So we see from the statistics that more than 40% of households in South Africa are headed by female breadwinners. And when it comes to child rearing, more than 42% of children live with only their single mothers, compared with 4% living only with their single fathers. So it's evident that women earn less due to the historic gender pay gap and career breaks they take, but also they have to make their lower income stretch further due to the caregiving responsibilities they perform. Now, interestingly, under the previous tax dispensation, there used to be a child care tax credit whereby you could claim certain childcare costs and reduce your tax liability. That was done away with, and we no longer have that rebate. So I think this is also something that Treasury could look again at reintroducing. In the United States, for example, you can get a tax rebate for certain childcare costs like after school care facilities, transport to and from school, and so forth.
And many people, you know, in discussion, Dr. Steenkamp, and would say that if you look at what's happening in South Africa at the moment, especially if you look at middle-class households, you have to pay for everything. It's, you know, a bond, it's private security, it's medical aid, all of these that you have to pay for, including, of course, school fees sometimes that are exorbitantly high, and university fees for your children. And people often ask, why do we not have some sort of tax rebate, some sort of tax break for that? Because it would go a long way into assisting, especially those female-headed single-income households.
Yes, exactly. So that is precisely what the Women's Report is calling for. I've barely scratched the surface with my research, and I think it's time for the Davis Tax Commission or the next tax commission in the near future to be specifically mandated to investigate the overall tax system, because as we know, if you change tax laws in one area, out pops an issue in another area. So it's not as easy as just introducing a new tax rebate or lowering tax rates for women. There needs to be an overall systemic approach to this. Another issue, of course, is value-added tax, VAT, that everyone pretty much pays. So we know that there's a list of zero-rated items whereby basic household goods are zero rated, so you don't pay the 15% value added tax. I think there's also an opportunity for government to look at expanding that list, adding more of the items that the lower income families, especially again the single parents, purchase on a regular basis.
So some people may say, Dr. Steenkamp, women are always, shouting, calling for equal opportunity, equal rights. So why should they then be treated differently when it comes to taxation?
Right. There's a difference between equality and equity. So our unisex tax table, for example, resulted in equal treatment. But as we see from the statistics, there's such a big gap still that women have to catch up with. So there isn't really the equity that the government sought to achieve. So the progressive income tax system that we have, to a certain extent, has achieved wealth redistribution, which was its primary goal. But now we need to look at the gender distribution of that of the income tax table. And we should also be careful that this doesn't become a man versus woman debate, because it's not. If you bring in the targeted tax relief, you could potentially provide that relief to all income taxpayers in a particular tax bracket, or who purchase specific goods and services for VAT, not just women. So everyone could potentially benefit from it. We should not take a blanket approach to this and say everyone who has a child should get a tax rebate necessarily. It should be means tested to really have targeted support there. Of course, if you remove or reduce taxes in one area, government has to make up that shortfall somewhere else. So we should also be mindful of that.
And I know you say, Dr. Steenkamp, that, we shouldn't reduce this to, a gendered argument. But when we talk about, as you point out, equal treatment, that has not resulted in equal outcomes. And I think that perhaps is the crux of the matter and what we need to understand more keenly.
Yes, and this is a complex issue. So the tax system is part of broader fiscal policy, and fiscal policy is part of the broader macroeconomic policy. So government has to weigh up all of these objectives, balance it with inflation targets, with interest payment, looking at tax revenues, trying to expand the tax base, and also think of all the social grants that it pays each month, which comes from taxpayers. So we have to take an overarching view of this issue, bearing in mind the fact that women perform unpaid care work, that women take career breaks, that there aren't any real childcare tax breaks available for women, especially, well, for any parents really, especially when it comes to school fees and, as you also say, university fees.
And those are quite exorbitant, and they are quite a strain on especially, and I'm going to say especially the middle class, Dr. Steenkamp, because if you are poor, you have the system that will cushion you through NSFAS, where government will pay for you. If you're wealthy, it's not really a thing. You have the money, you have the resources to pay for it. But it is this middle class that sat there, paying for everything, being squeezed through taxation as well, and there just seem to be very few breaks.
Yes, that's unfortunately the case. Also sometimes referred to as the missing middle. You're too poor to afford some of the items that you really need. You're too wealthy to qualify for some of the grants. So again, as part of the overarching view of the tax system, one could also look at addressing some of those types of expenses, like university fees, perhaps allowing a tax deduction for that. That would certainly assist in some regards. The tax, we should also bear in mind, is a social contract with government. And I think it's quite clear that that contract has not been always honoured by government. Taxpayers, especially personal income taxpayers, bear the brunt of the revenue system, and we don't seem to get a lot in exchange for that. If you have to pay for securing your home, burglar bars and security systems, because government is really failing to protect its citizens. You have to pay for medical scheme fees. You have to pay for school and university. Whereas in some other countries who also have high tax rates, government provides that free of charge. So this is definitely part of a broader discussion that we should be having.
So speaking about that social compact, how do we move on some of the suggestions that you make in your research? For example, Dr. Steenkamp, what are you going to do now with your research? And how does society benefit more from maybe engaging government on this particular matter? How do we go about advocating for and agitating for some of these changes that we would like to see?
This is where we start. We start by having this conversation, and I really believe that knowledge is power. So taxpayers, especially women, should empower themselves with knowledge and should not delegate the responsibility for their financial well-being, their retirement planning, to their partners or to anyone else. Secondly, I'm calling for more research. So if you recall from a few years ago, there was a lot of pushback from civil society groups, which resulted in feminine hygiene products being added to the zero-rated list of the VAT Act. And if we think of the power of coming together and for advocating for women's rights, the effect that that could have. So I think going forward from academia's side, we could lobby government. There are different channels that one could do that from, but we need a concerted effort for this.
Indeed. And Dr. Steenkamp, as you move forward, please keep us informed so that we can basically broadcast the message and start that advocacy and agitate for the changes we'd like to see.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time this morning. A very interesting conversation there, and from the research of Dr. Lee-Ann Steenkamp there, and important because, as Dr. Steenkamp points out, you know, we are taxed equally, but the outcomes of that taxation is not equal, and you have women bearing the brunt of that. Also, you know, stating the facts that we know that we have so many more female-headed single households, single-income households than male-headed households of the same kind. And how does this tax regime impact on them? And there has to be some changes in order to bring about this necessary relief that we seek. But Dr. Steenkamp has pointed out we need more research, and of course we'll keep our tabs on this particular matter, but also keep in touch with Dr. Steenkamp to find out how do we move forward, how do we come up and sign a new social compact around these matters. Dr. Lee-Ann Steenkamp is a senior lecturer in taxation at Stellenbosch Business School.